It had been 6 years since my divorce, and I unexpectedly ran into my ex-husband while holding my 3-year-old daughter at a street corner. He looked at the girl in my arms in a daze. After a long pause, he frowned and, with a tone of accusation, said, "She's almost 6 years old. Why does she look so small and skinny?" Maybe he thought that the child I was holding was his. Perhaps he believed that my love for him was so deep that even after he cheated and divorced me, I would still have given birth to his child. I was just about to tell him I was pregnant again when I found out. The test results were still in my hand, not yet shown to him. George sat on the couch, his attitude cold and unyielding. He told me that 6 months ago he had an affair. Now, the woman he was seeing was pregnant, and he wanted to keep the child, which meant he had to divorce me. I thought I might have misheard, but before I could even ask, George looked me straight in the eyes, expressionless, and said, "You heard me correctly." It felt like my heart was pierced by countless needles, pain spreading in waves until I could barely stand. Never expected my marriage to reach such a point. George was very handsome, but he had a cold, indifferent personality and was slow to warm up to others. In school, he was famously brilliant in science. Many girls liked him, but I was the only one persistent enough to pursue him for 2 years until he finally agreed to be with me. I genuinely loved him. After we got together, even though I was often the one reaching out to him, he gradually got used to my presence. We married right after graduating from university. 5 years together, 3 years of dating, and 2 of marriage end. He was already tired of me. I couldn't accept it. My hands trembled as I reached into my bag to pull out the test results, wanting to tell George I was pregnant too. But halfway through pulling it out, I stopped. Tears streamed down my face like broken pearls. What was the point of showing it to him now? I asked myself honestly, even if George agreed to return to the family after his affair, would I still want him? No, I wouldn't. I found him disgusting, utterly disgusting. It seemed like George was afraid I would cause a scene. After telling me he wanted a divorce, he grabbed his keys and left without looking back. He didn't come back until the next morning. I spent the entire night crying on the couch, trying to understand why George had cheated. As a rising star in business, George had been managing his family's struggling company, which had begun to improve thanks to his efforts over the past 2 years. Because of this, he was always busy working during the day and attending social events at night. That had become his routine. How did he even find the time to cheat? When he finally returned, he stood silently at the doorway, hands in his pockets, staring at me. He showed no sign of concern for my despair. Even though my eyes were so swollen, I could barely see. I looked back at him from the couch. I don't know how long it was before I heard him say, "Have you cried enough?" Cried enough. Looking back on the past 5 years, whenever we argued, regardless of who was at fault, Ty was always the one to back down first. Never once tried to comfort me. My one-sided devotion had now become self-deception. I struggled to stand up from the couch, a sharp pain stabbing in my lower abdomen. I chose to ignore it, lifting my chin and asking George why. Why did he cheat? After knowing each other for 7 years and being together for 5, I had imagined countless reasons why George might ask for a divorce. As long as it wasn't because of cheating, I would have forgiven him for anything. But he had cheated, George. Looked away, a hint of impatience crossing his face. "There's no reason, Chloe. Our fate has run its course. Can't we part on good terms?" Fate has run its course. Part on good terms. At that moment, my heart shattered completely. Under George's gaze, I nodded. "Fine," I forced a smile. "Let's divorce." Because I agreed, everything went smoothly. We didn't even notify our families. We got the divorce certificate as quickly as we had gotten the marriage certificate. George, being at fault, gave me a large sum of compensation and even gifted me the house we shared. After 2 years of marriage, it took him only half a day to pack his things. I watched as he loaded his luggage into the car and drove off without once looking back. 5 years. I thought even if you were raising a dog for that long, you would have developed some affection, wouldn't you? When George decided to be ruthless, he truly was. Because of that, I suddenly wanted to see the woman he had cheated with. How good could she be to make George commit the most disgraceful act of his life, infidelity? In the end, I resisted the urge to see her. Since we were divorced, staying out of each other's lives felt like the best way to respect what we once had. The day after the divorce, I received a WeChat message from George's sister, Mary. She asked me who the woman was that George had brought home. Her message was followed by 3 laughing emojis mocking me. I stared at the message for a long time before letting it go. I replied, "That's your new sister-in-law." After sending that, I deleted Mary's contact from my phone. She had never liked me, and sending that message was just another way to make me uncomfortable. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I wasn't brave enough to be a single mother. So on the 3rd day after the divorce, I went to the hospital and scheduled a painless abortion. The elderly gynecologist, with a stern face, told me I would need a family member to accompany me for the procedure. I had no family in the city, but I had a few close friends. On the day of the surgery, I called one of my best friends to come with me. Just as I was about to enter the operating room, she suddenly grabbed my hand, her face filled with concern. "Chloe, will you regret this?" Of course I would. I already knew the answer, but there were 2 possible answers and both would lead to pain. After I was discharged from the hospital, I resigned from my job. I had come to this city because of George, and now I was leaving because of him. Looking back, I realized that I had spent most of my youth orbiting around George. No wonder he got tired of me, took care of my health, and rested at home for a month. Before leaving, I entrusted the house to a real estate agent to sell. 2 hours before my flight, George suddenly called. We had cut all ties more than a month ago since the divorce, and there was no reason for either of us to reach out, much less for George to initiate contact. I hesitated for a moment, but answered the call. "Hello." George's calm voice came through the receiver. "Are you selling the house?" he asked. I froze instinctively. "Can't I sell it?" There was a long silence on the other end. After a while, George said coldly, "Do as you please," and then hung up. Ha! Did George still think I would indulge his temper like I used to? Ridiculous. I stared at my phone expressionless for a while. Before I left, I went to the nearest phone. Shopin canceled my number. From now on, I didn't want to have any contact with George. I was born in a small town where things moved slowly, and life wasn't as busy as in many cities. My grandmother, now in her 80s, held my hand tightly the moment she saw me. Kept looking at me, scolding me for not eating enough and for being too thin. I slowed my steps, walking home with her as the golden sunset bathed everything around us, just like when I was a child. Seeing her white hair and her hunched back made my heart ache, slow and late, like a wave of sadness catching up with me. During the years I spent chasing after George, how many times had my dear grandmother waited at the village entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of me stepping off the bus? I was raised by her, and my relationship with my parents wasn't very close. I hadn't even told them I was back after the divorce. On the 12th day of my return, a neighbor brought over her, phoned from my grandmother. Her face looked complicated as she looked at me, and I immediately understood my parents were calling. When my grandmother handed me the phone, the woman on the other end was yelling furiously. I hung up without saying a word. Less than a minute later, the phone rang again. I barely said hello before the shouting started even louder. I hung up again. After 4 or 5 calls, she finally stopped shouting. It's no longer yelling. She demanded I give her my new phone number, accusing me of not informing her about something as big as my divorce, asking what I was thinking. I pursed my lips and said quietly, "I'm thinking that it only took you 2 months to remember me this time, which is shorter than last time." The silence on the other end was deafening. When I was young, my family was poor. After I was born, my parents decided to leave and try their luck somewhere else, leaving me with my grandmother. A few years later, they made some money and had another child, a little sister for me. They justified this by saying I wasn't close to them. Later, during a summer break, they tried to bring me home to bond. My sister was 6, and I was 11. At that age, I wasn't interested in fighting over toys with a little kid. But my sister, whom I'd met only a few times, harbored hostility toward me. I had picked up her Barbie doll, which had been tossed on the couch, and placed it on the table. When my parents came home from work, the doll was missing an arm and a leg. My sister sat quietly, clutching the doll and sobbing softly. She knew. Acting like this would make everyone dote on her more. My parents looked at me with complicated expressions. I tried to explain it wasn't me, insisting I had nothing to do with it. To this day, I still remember the helplessness I felt then. My mother waved her hand dismissively, her tone perfunctory. All right, I know it wasn't you." But as she turned away, she whispered to my father, thinking I couldn't hear, "How did your mom raise her to be like this?" My father said nothing, silently agreeing that I had broken the doll. Later, they bought more beautiful Barbie dolls and locked them in a storage room only. The three of them had the key. I'm slightly allergic to seafood, something my grandmother always remembered, so seafood was never on our family's dining table. Before I went to stay with my parents, my grandmother reminded my mother not to let me eat any seafood. My mother nodded in agreement. But on the third day at their house, I ended up in the hospital because of a bowl of seafood porridge. As I struggled to breathe in the emergency room, I could hear my parents arguing just outside the door. "I didn't know she was allergic to seafood," my mother said. My father's voice was full of frustration. "Didn't Mom tell you?" "She said so many things I can't remember them all." My mother's tone turned sharp. "Besides, she's old enough now. Shouldn't she know what she can and can't eat? I think she just wanted to try it. Her sister wanted some, and she didn't want to miss out, ... Now they were probably angry because the George they used to look down on had become a rising star in the business world. I had let go of the golden son-in-law, who could have brought them business advantages. Otherwise, why else would they suddenly think to call me? Given how serious the situation was, my parents actually rushed back that very night. Behind them was my younger sister, who was in university. Our eyes met, and I could see the barely hidden schadenfreude in her gaze. After 2 years without seeing them, they had aged noticeably. The wrinkles at the corners of their eyes were deeper, even when they weren't smiling. The nasolabial folds on my mother's face had become more pronounced, giving her a sharper, harsher look. Ignoring my grandmother's enthusiastic greeting, my mother cast a cold glance in my direction. She hadn't even sat down before she angrily scolded me. "Chloe, have you grown wings? How could you get a divorce without consulting us about something so major?" My grandmother was shocked by this news, glancing between my mother and me. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say something but decided against it. Knowing that my family ties were superficial, I felt no emotional stir. I simply stroked the tabby cat on my lap without saying a word. My mother couldn't stand my indifference, and raised her voice sharply. "Chloe, is this how you treat your own mother? No wonder your marriage failed." You, just as her words grew more and more unreasonable, my father reached out to tug at her sleeve. He clicked his tongue in disapproval, his face showing his dissatisfaction. "You've lost your mind," he said.
"How can you say that to your own child?"
Realizing she had overstepped, my mother couldn't bring herself to apologize. She huffed and turned away. My father looked at me awkwardly, as if expecting me to apologize to her. I was the one being scolded, and I was supposed to apologize. For what? Is there some rule written somewhere that children owe something to their parents? My grandmother quietly brought over some tea, gently reminding everyone, whatever it is, you should talk it through properly with the child. My mother shot her an irritated look. "What do you know? Chloe's boldness is all because of you spoiling her." She often used my grandmother as an emotional punching bag. For the sake of family harmony, my grandmother always endured silently. I set the tabby cat on the ground and watched it trot away, then turned to my father and asked, "How did you find out about the divorce?" My father gave a sheepish laugh. "George called your mother and me. Said he hadn't been able to reach you for some time and was worried, ... I pursed my lips, finding the situation absurdly funny. He was the one who cheated. He was the one who brought up divorce first. He was the one talking about fate running its course and parting on good terms. I didn't cling to him. Since we were divorced and had no children to tie us together, I had every intention of cutting all ties with him. Meanwhile, my mother kept going on about how great George was. Every time she praised him, she subtly implied that my bad temper was to blame, that I should have been grateful George put up with me at all. I held my cup of water, sipping slowly. By the time I finished, she had already gone over most of my old mistakes, finally concluding that there must be something wrong with my brain, of course. If my brain worked properly, why would I agree to a divorce after enduring 5 years of hardship with George, just as he was starting to succeed? I pressed my aching temples and cut off their discussion. Have you said enough? Both of my parents turned to look at me. I didn't bother with any subtlety and said flatly, "If you're done, you should leave now while you can still get tickets to go back." My mother stared at me, eyes wide, then launched into another tirade. She called me an ungrateful wretch, a cold-hearted daughter. I glanced at her, stood up, and walked out. Cold-heartedness runs in the family, inherited it from them, and it's not anyone else's fault. I found a small inn in town and stayed there. As soon as I settled in, George called. I looked at those familiar 11 digits. After hesitating for a moment, I decided not to answer, but George didn't give up, kept calling again and again. When he called for the 7th time, I finally answered. There was no sound on the other end, just George's steady breathing. I didn't say anything either, simply watched the call timer tick, waiting for it to reach 2 minutes. Then I broke the silence. Fate has run its course, and we're parting on good terms. That's what you said. I don't usually keep in touch with ex-husbands, George. Whatever it is, don't call me again. The silence stretched on. I wasn't planning to wait for George to respond. After hanging up, I immediately blocked his number. My best friend was right. Trash belongs in the trash. George hadn't been particularly kind to me during our marriage. Now that we were divorced, what was the point of pretending to be some lovesick romantic? Didn't he find that hypocritical? I knew my parents well. After struggling through tough times, they were especially afraid of going back to them. Why we were never very close? This time I knew they wouldn't stay more than a week. The only way to avoid seeing them was to stay away. I turned off my phone and stayed at the inn for 7 days. On the 7th evening, my grandmother, leaning on her old cane, slowly made her way to find me. This elderly woman, well into her 80s, had taken slow, careful steps all the way. From the village to the town, I could imagine her asking for directions along the way. The setting sun cast an orange glow on her white hair, and her toothless smile lit up her face as she said, "Chloe, they've left. Let's go home." Grandma's words took me back to my school days, when I'd finished late-night classes, and she'd always wait for me at the village entrance. I thought I'd outgrown crying, that I was past the age of tears. But in that moment, I couldn't stop the flood of emotion. After we returned home, I finally turned my phone back on. As expected, my parents bombarded me with long messages on WeChat, full of accusations about my lack of filial piety. I didn't even bother opening them. George had also sent a message from a new number. He said he just wanted to make sure it was safe, that after all, we had once been husband and wife. He promised not to contact me again and wished me well. He added that he would continue sending me a monthly allowance. I paid no mind to it. With a 7-figure bank balance, I had all the confidence I needed. I longed to see vast landscapes, mountains, rivers, lakes. I wanted to witness sunrises and sunsets in the 2nd year of traveling with my grandmother. I ran into an old high school classmate, David. I vaguely remembered him as someone who was top of the class, quiet and reserved. We didn't have much contact back then, but I knew he existed. Later, we ended up attending the same university and occasionally crossed paths. Though we were little more than acquaintances, he was carrying a camera and a simple backpack, also traveling. When we met, with our next destinations aligned, we decided to travel together. He didn't talk much, but he was respectful and thoughtful, especially toward my grandmother, who adored him. One night, lying in bed with my grandmother, gazing at the stars through the skylight, she suddenly said, "David is a good boy." I understood what she meant and forced a dry chuckle. Yes, he is. When it comes to matters of the heart, elderly people tend to be especially perceptive. But between me and David, Although we shared interests, there was an unbridgeable gap. I admired him. But that didn't mean I had feelings for him. I guessed he probably felt the same way. Grandma, being elderly, needed to rest for a couple of days whenever we arrived somewhere new to regain her energy. Because of that, I was worried about delaying my schoolmate David's travel plans, and I often suggested he should go ahead without us. He didn't reject my suggestion, but simply replied, "Can part ways at the next stop. I'd like to stay here for a few more days too." The misty rain over Jiangnan, the ancient town scenery, it was as beautiful as a painting. Surrounded by such beauty, my mood lifted. I couldn't help but glance at David a few times. Unlike George, who was strikingly handsome but flamboyant, David's sharp features carried a softness that gave him a scholarly, approachable air. At first sight, noticing my gaze, he smiled politely. The distant mountains reflected in his dark eyes, giving him a calm, serene aura. The winding paths of the old town, the gentle rain creating a light mist, everything felt like a fairyland. Told Grandma I wanted to go for a walk. Grandma, feeling her age, didn't want to walk much. She sat under the eaves with some elderly women from the town. They chatted in a mix of dialect and heavily accented Mandarin, laughing heartily, though it was unclear if they truly understood each other. I stood watching for a while until I heard approaching footsteps. I turned my head, and through the misty rain, I saw David walking toward me, holding a paper umbrella with a jade handle. He stopped beside me, standing tall and graceful, a figure of quiet elegance unlike any I'd seen before. He asked if I wanted to go for a walk together. It was exactly what I wanted. We wandered through the old town under the oil paper umbrella, passing by green bricks and tiled roofs. He didn't talk much. Most of the conversation was initiated by me. Listened carefully and responded earnestly, as if trying to find the perfect answer to every question. I found it amusing. Honestly, I was no longer at an age where I could be easily moved. When we reached our next destination, David and I parted ways. After that, Grandma and I crossed 3 mountains and 2 lakes, and I never saw him again. We left home at the start of winter and didn't return until the end of summer. Grandma had a newfound spring in her step, always going out with her cane to chat with neighbors, telling them all about the vast landscapes we'd seen during our travels. Several elderly folks in the village, her peers, looked at her with envy and longing, even though her descriptions were often lacking. But there were also those who couldn't stand to see Grandma happy. Over tea or dinner, they'd deliberately ask me about my marriage. Grandma's smile would stiffen, and after a long pause, she'd sigh. "Young folks' affairs are beyond us," she'd say, waving her hand dismissively. The woman who had raised the topic shot her a meaningful look, and that was the end of the conversation. After resting at home for a few days, I started making new plans for my life. I'd studied civil engineering in college, though I wasn't very good at my courses. I had also taken quite a few agricultural classes. In a small town like this, land was plentiful. I decided to lease a few acres to grow flowers and sell them. During this time, Mary contacted me multiple times via WeChat, always probing to see if I had truly moved on from her brother. I had loved George deeply, but in their eyes, my seemingly carefree departure was just a strategic retreat. I had wasted too much time on George, poured too much effort into that relationship, and leaving meant losing years of my youth. The cost had been high. Around this time, I was busy setting up plastic greenhouses on the land I'd leased. I didn't have the time or desire to respond to Mary, and eventually, the matter was left unresolved. I wasn't that clueless. I knew when to cut my losses. Just as the greenhouses were about to be finished, an unexpected visitor arrived at my home. He was sitting in the courtyard chatting with my grandmother. His posture was straight, and as the setting sun cast a soft glow on his profile, he looked gentle and handsome. Sensing my presence, David turned his head and smiled at me. "I was passing by and thought I'd stop by to see you." For the first time in a long while, my heart skipped a beat before settling back into its usual rhythm. He came to visit and didn't. T mentioned leaving again once he was settled in. Every morning, he'd go out with me, carrying his camera, following behind and taking pictures along the way. Sometimes I'd walk far ahead, only to find he'd stopped somewhere. I'd wait for him when we reached our destination. He'd show me the photos he'd taken. Misty mornings, rising smoke, crossing fields, scattered houses nestled among green mountains and blue waters. The scenery in the small town had its own. Charmed when I snapped back to reality, I realized how close we'd become. We'd exchange glances, then quickly look away, feeling a bit flustered. I noticed a faint blush spreading across the tips of David's ears. That was when I became aware that something felt different. So, on the day the flowers in my field started breaking through the soil, I invited David to share a drink in the wooden house by the flower fields. As the alcohol took effect, I poured out everything that had happened between George and me over the years. David was momentarily stunned, but he was sharp and quickly understood my unspoken meaning. After a brief pause, he let out a sigh. In the soft yellow light, his gaze was intense as he looked at me. "You don't need to say anything. I already know." Okay. But he didn't say how he knew. By then, my passionate love for George had faded, and I wasn't sure if I still had the capacity to love someone else. But I also knew it wasn't the right time. The flowers I'd planted at the end of summer sprouted in early autumn. By deep winter, they'd produced small buds. David's camera captured their entire growth. He'd shifted from being a travel blogger to a gardening blogger, and he was really enjoying it. Habits are powerful. I had to admit that in just a few months, I'd gotten used to having David around. Before I knew it, the new year arrived. On the first day of spring, the roses and Chinese roses in the greenhouses bloomed at the same time. I couldn't tell the difference between them, so I picked one of each to examine closely. David silently approached, bending down beside me to observe the flowers. We were so close I could smell the faint scent of soap on him, fresh and pleasant. On a whim, I asked, "Do you know the difference between a rose and a Chinese rose?" "Could you tell the difference between a rose and a Chinese rose and between me and her?" David, who had spent plenty of time online, probably understood the deeper meaning behind my question. He was momentarily taken aback, then slowly smiled. "Chloe, there was never a her. There's only you." He looked up at me, his dark eyes full of something deep and tender. In that moment, the sea of flowers around us couldn't compare to the beauty of his eyes. Suddenly, I felt like my emotional walls were crashing down. It wasn't that I couldn't love. Once I was sure of my feelings, I officially entered a relationship with David at the end of March, even after the relationship changed status. Our interactions didn't really change much. After half a year together, David remained as gentle and easygoing as when we first met. In April, my flower fields finally opened up to both online and offline sales, and I no longer had issues with slow sales. When my parents found out I'd started growing flowers, they called me. My mother's voice was sharp and grating, and everything she said seemed meant to belittle me. She accused me of having no ambition, saying I was destined to rot in the dirt for the rest of my life. I couldn't understand why my biological parents harbored so much malice toward me. In the end, I just stopped caring. Calmly, I said, "If you despise me so much, then from now on, just pretend you never had me." My mother's shrill shouting suddenly stopped. My father quickly took over the phone, scolding me for being old enough to know better and asking why I was still acting so immature. I laughed. Well, at least I had one daughter who knew better. Clearly, having me in their lives was one too many. My father sighed, telling me to calm down, then hung up. I took a deep breath of the flower-scented air, only to see David walking toward me, holding a bouquet of baby's breath. He handed me the flowers and awkwardly scratched his nose, asking if I liked them, even though I kept my emotions in check. He seemed to sense my discomfort. I lowered my gaze to look at the flowers and suddenly remembered their meaning: silent guardianship, love. I thought about how, whenever I had conflicts with my parents before, George would always frown at me and criticize my bad temper. I leaned in and hugged David. His body stiffened at first, but then his arms tightened around my waist. I could hear his heartbeat pounding faster and faster. In that moment, I felt a deep longing for this warmth. In the 5th year of our relationship, our daughter turned 3, and she would start kindergarten in September. Because of household registration issues, David had to return to H-City. For a while, I wasn't planning to go with him at first, but when my best friend found out, she insisted I visit her. She used every trick in the book to persuade me. I hadn't seen her in over 2 years and I missed her, so I decided to go with David. As soon as we arrived in H-City, we went straight to the local police station to handle our daughter's household registration, since it would take a while. I decided to take her for a walk down the street. Being in an unfamiliar place, my daughter was curious about everything and refused to walk, stretching out her arms to be carried. She'd been spoiled by David and had become somewhat delicate of him, tearing up when things didn't go her way. As I carried her, we turned a corner and suddenly saw a familiar figure. My first instinct was to walk away. But in the next moment, George looked up, and his eyes briefly flicked over me before snapping back in surprise. We locked eyes from across the street. I tightened my hold on my daughter and turned my face away, expressionless. We were now just the most familiar strangers, nothing more. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw George put out his half-smoked cigarette and stride toward me. Not wanting to get involved with him, I turned to leave. "Chloe." George called after me. I frowned but stopped walking. He hurried over, glancing at me, then his gaze landed on the child in my arms. After a long pause, he frowned and said, with an accusatory tone, "Your daughter is almost 6 now. Why does she look so small and skinny? 6 years old?" Did he seriously think I had given birth to his child on my own after the divorce? Feeling danger, my daughter wrapped her thin arms around my neck, burying her little face into my shoulder, softly calling for her daddy. I patted her back gently to soothe her, then looked at George. After 6 years, he hadn't changed much. Was no awkward reunion, no irritation at seeing each other again. Whatever love or resentment I once felt for him had long since faded over the years. George looked at me briefly before his gaze returned to our daughter. His expression grew complicated, his eyes lowered, hard to read. Based on his earlier comment, I guessed what he was thinking. He must have thought this was the child I'd lost back then. He'd known about the pregnancy all along and had done nothing for 6 years. Typical George. A sudden urge to laugh bubbled up inside me, but before I could, a deep sadness welled within. How blind I'd been back then. After a brief silence, George took a step forward. His words were interrupted by another voice, "Luna." My daughter immediately perked up when she heard the sound, lifting her head excitedly and calling out "Daddy" at the sight of David coming toward us from the street. David's gaze briefly flicked over George before he strode over to me. He nodded at George, then reached out to take our daughter from my arms. She snuggled into his shoulder, occasionally calling out "Daddy" in her sweet little voice, and he gently patted her head, smiling indulgently. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shock and disbelief on George's face. He must have recognized David. A sense of satisfaction welled up inside me, and I said lightly, "My daughter just turned 3. The spark of light that had briefly appeared in George's eyes disappeared instantly. "George, it's been 6 years. It's time to wake up from this long dream," I added calmly. After soothing our daughter for a moment, David turned to me. Holding her in one arm, he extended his other hand toward me. "Shall we go?" he asked. I nodded naturally, taking his hand. We had only taken a few steps when we ran into someone else's Faya, always been George's biggest rival. In school, I remembered they never really got along. In school, besides competing in various contests, they seemed to have little interaction, and even when passing each other, they'd look away in mutual disdain. Sophia was visibly taken aback. When she saw me, her lips twitched awkwardly as she avoided my gaze and turned her attention to her right. She was holding hands with a boy around 6 or 7. When she saw George, the boy let go of her hand and ran toward him, calling out "Daddy." Ah! So, that's how it was. In that instant, everything clicked into place. I glanced back at George. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but he quickly turned his head away. Avoiding my eyes, David squeezed my hand a little tighter, and I calmly turned away, walking on. As we passed Sophia, I heard her voice, "Chloe, congratulations." I paused, then let out a cold laugh. "I should thank you for that," I said. "Huh. What right did the woman who had once come between my marriage have to pretend to be sincere in front of me? The people who leave you behind those old days aren't worth holding on to anymore. When we returned from H-City, life for our little family of 3 settled back into its peaceful, sweet rhythm. About 2 weeks later, while I was pruning, flowers. I looked up to see David holding our daughter, his face dark as he stared out the window. He'd always been gentle, but I'd never seen such an expression on his face before. I followed his gaze and saw a familiar figure standing outside. George was in the courtyard talking to my grandmother, but his eyes were fixed on the window. No wonder David looked so upset. But what was George doing here? After calming our daughter, David gave me a look and left me with a quiet instruction: don't go out before stepping outside. Through the window, I watched as he and George exchanged words. The 2 men, similar in age, radiated completely different energies, each with his own unique charm. I barely spared George a glance, my eyes fixed on David. Once I looked at him, I couldn't seem to look away. I'd never seen him so tense. His whole posture radiated hostility. I watched him for a while longer before realizing I was smiling unconsciously. When David walked back inside, my smile remained. He paused, noticing my expression, and his eyes darkened with an unreadable emotion. "You seem very happy," he said. Realizing he might have misunderstood, I explained plainly, "I've never seen you so angry at anyone before." His face softened a little at my words. He picked up our daughter, who was playing with blocks, and with her between us, pulled me into his embrace. His voice reached my ear. "Go talk to him." "Moment," he added softly. "Don't do anything foolish." I stood beneath the grapevines in the courtyard, facing George. Even though it had only been half a month since I last saw him, he looked much more worn out. His face was unshaven, and his clothes were wrinkled, something I'd never seen from George before. He stared at me silently, and the atmosphere between us felt heavy. Grandma probably felt uncomfortable with the tension. She stood up with her cane and said she wanted to take a walk since the courtyard was stuffy. Once she left, I broke the silence first. "George, even though it's been many years, there's something I've always wanted to ask you," I said softly. A flicker of hope appeared in his dull eyes. I guessed he thought I was going to ask if he had ever loved me. How shallow. George cleared his throat, and though his voice was hoarse, he said, "Go ahead." I saw a tall figure at the window, lips curling up slightly. I leaned forward and asked quietly, "Did the stolen fruit taste sweet?" George froze in place, his expression cracking, little by little. His lips moved as if he wanted to speak, but no words came out. A wave of satisfaction surged inside me. His grip on the grapevine trellis turned his knuckles white. "I'm sorry," he finally managed to say, though it was 6 years too late. I thought... The rest of his words wouldn't come. Thought what, I wondered? That I loved him so much that even after the divorce I would have given birth to his child and raised it alone. But George, no one is born owing anything to anyone. You're over 30 now. How do you still not understand that? I said nothing, my gaze cold as I looked at him. George met my eyes, his bloodshot gaze holding mine. Then, with one final sentence, he left. "Chloe, you probably won't believe this, but I really do regret it." I paused, then slowly smiled. And what of it? No one knows better than I do that George didn't truly regret what he had done. He was just uncomfortable seeing that I was doing better without him, happier even than when we were together. In other words, even if George did regret it, so what? What right does he have to come back after all the pain and tell me he regrets? Don't talk to me about better late than never. Now, one thing I despise most in this life are reformed scoundrels. After 6 years apart, George still fooled himself into thinking I would have had that child his confidence rooted in my once unwavering devotion to him. When he finally realized what he'd lost, it was inevitable he couldn't accept it. In the end, I was more at peace with everything than he was, and I had no desire to keep the conversation going. My words pushed him to leave sooner rather than later. George left my house, but he didn't leave town. He rented a room at a nearby inn, and every morning he would stand far off, watching our home from a distance. Each day, David's face grew darker, though he tried not to show his feelings in front of me or our daughter. One night, while I was asleep, David quietly dressed and slipped out of the house. As soon as he left, I got up and secretly followed him. Sure enough, David had arranged to meet George. I crouched under a window, eavesdropping on their conversation. After a long silence, George was the first to speak. Before I came here, Sophia told me everything. When I saw her again, I found out that your hand was behind it all. My heart sank, but I quickly composed myself. So that's what broke George? David said nothing. I heard George grit his teeth. Quite the scheme you pulled off. There was more silence. I quietly stood up and peered through a crack in the window to see inside. So what? Heard David say, standing in the shadow cast by the fluorescent light. From my angle, I couldn't see his face, only hear his cold voice. Love is something you have to fight for, isn't it? His tone dripped with sarcasm. I've loved Chloe since I was 18. At 28, I loved her even more. And now, at 32, my love for her only grows. But you have a restless nature. Would have been someone else. Chloe's life with you was nothing short of torment. The opportunity was right there in front of me. Why wouldn't I take it? And what if Chloe finds out? George's voice wavered with a flicker of hope. What? If Chloe finds out that you interfered with her marriage, can you guarantee she won't hold it against you? For a brief moment, David stepped out of the shadows, his expression unreadable. But then he retreated back into the darkness the next day. When I saw George again, I walked straight over to him. Before he could speak, I cut him off. I heard everything you two talked about last night. A spark of hope flickered in George's eyes. He pressed his lips together. Chloe, there was nothing between Sophia and me. Everything was. I cut him off coldly. Our marriage was never a happy one. You never really cared about me. Your parents and even your sister always thought I married you to climb the social ladder. They never accepted me. Past since the divorce, we both had moved on, built our own families now. So why did he come all this way to find me, do you think? I trailed off, letting out a bitter laugh. George, we were once married. Don't make me lose all respect. For you, the last flicker of light in George's eyes went out. Fate had run its course. Let's part on good terms, he said, echoing words he once told me. In the distance, I saw David waving at me, holding our daughter in his arms. I smiled and walked, past George toward them. Our daughter stood between us as David and I exchanged a glance, and we couldn't help but laugh together, hand in hand with our daughter between us. We slowly headed toward the flower fields. The sun still shone brightly, and life was beautiful as ever. The end of a marriage doesn't mean the end of happiness. It can be the start of something even better, as long as you stay true to yourself. Someone will be willing to brave all the fog just to be with you. Bonus. George. The sunlight was blinding as it streamed through the window, waking me from a hangover with a pounding head. The phone next to my pillow kept ringing, Sophia's name flashing repeatedly on the screen. I felt irritated and hurled the phone against the wall. It shattered into pieces, and finally, everything was silent. I rubbed my temples. But Chloe's words still echoed in my mind, its syllable cutting through me. They were the same words I had once said, yet now when she threw them back at me, they pierced my heart with brutal clarity. It's been 6 years since the divorce. We both had our own families now. We shouldn't be interfering in each other's lives, but I couldn't help it, even after I'd learned there might have been a child between us. I thought about finding her, but I never did. I knew Chloe loved me. She loved me more than anyone. Being loved makes you arrogant. I cheated. So I still felt invincible. That wasn't until I saw her again, 6 years later, standing next to David Lior. Maybe David Sue. No one ever knew the hidden thoughts I once harbored. No one knew that the reason I coincidentally appeared in Chloe's life was because I knew David had feelings for her. I didn't understand it. How could someone as proud as David marry a divorced woman? Chapter 2. The year I met David, he was still using the surname Sue, his father's name. David was perfect in every way, kind, polite, and academically talented. Though only a year older than me, he was seen as the golden boy, everyone's favorite, including my parents at first. I saw David just as the boy next door. I didn't like him, or did I dislike him? He was just there. That changed one day when my father, seeing me sweaty and exhausted after a long day of playing, sighed and said something I've never forgotten. "If only you were as well behaved as David." It was the first time I'd heard my strict, serious father praise anyone. And it wasn't me. Jealousy began to creep into my heart without me realizing it. When my mother praised David's excellent grades, my sister said, "David, you're so much better than my brother." I started paying more attention to him. I noticed his life was simple. He studied, grew flowers, and took care of a cat. He liked sitting under the garden tree, reading. His upper body was in the shade, while his legs basked in the sunlight. A chubby orange tabby slept lazily on his lap, eyes half closed. Sunlight, flowers, a boy, and a chubby cat under a tree. Everything looked so peaceful. A sweet, gentle boy. No wonder the adults adored him. Started copying David's way of being, softening my personality, imitating his mannerisms, dressing like him. Even I knew I was just pretending. I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. Then, when I was 16 and David was 17, everything changed. One day after school, David saw a tiny tabby cat stuck in a tree, too scared to come down. Tall and lanky, David looked worried. He'd scare the kitten, so he took off his jacket and held it out, signaling to the cat that it could jump and he'd catch it. The kitten was anxious, meowing nonstop, but it didn't dare to jump. The boy and the cat were locked in a standoff. I scoffed, thinking David's compassion was over the top after about 10 minutes. The kitten finally jumped, and David caught it in his arms. I didn't know a passerby had taken a photo of the scene. Later, when I arrived a little late, I saw the kitten's owner, a pretty, delicate girl. Maybe because David and I looked similar from behind, the girl mistook me for him. She came over to thank me. She was a clear-eyed 16 or 17-year-old girl, her gaze transparent as if you could see right through her. But I had no intention of claiming credit for something I hadn't done. I wasn't that low. Then one day I saw that same girl handing David a bottle of water after he finished playing basketball. David stared after her for a moment, blinking rapidly. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. I knew David better than he knew himself. I recognized that look. It was interest, maybe even the start of love. In all the years I'd known him, it was the first time I'd seen David show interest in a girl. That petty, disgusting feeling took root in my heart, spreading uncontrollably. Being with Chloe turned out to be easier than I'd expected, and I saw David's disappointed gaze more than once during that time. That only made me more determined to stay with Chloe. Finally, when David turned 18, an illegitimate child of his father came forward, shaking the entire family. David's mother, proud and fiery, couldn't stomach the shame. Despite her good upbringing, she couldn't bring herself to insult anyone publicly. Instead, she quietly left the family with David. For the first time, I was free from David's shadow, for reasons I still don't fully understand. I didn't break up with Chloe. She had a wonderful personality, way more interesting than I'd thought. After living for 17 or 18 years, she was the first girl I'd ever truly gotten close to. By then, I couldn't tell if my feelings for her were genuine or just born out of that early determination. It seemed natural that, after graduation, we got married at first. I really believed I'd spend my life with Chloe. But then, everything changed. I don't even want to think about how. In the end, I was the one who hurt her. After the divorce, we were supposed to go our separate ways. So why did I chase her all the way here? Maybe, as Chloe said, even after the divorce, I couldn't stand to see her with someone else, especially when that someone was David, the one person I'd been trying to avoid. The day before I was leaving, Sophia showed up with my sister. They couldn't find me, so naturally they went to Chloe. When I arrived, my sister was yelling insults at Chloe, mocking her for interfering in someone else's family after her divorce. Chloe's face was unreadable. She glanced at my sister and Sophia, her voice cold. "What happened? Did the leash on your dogs break? Why are they barking at my door?" My sister's face turned livid, but before she could reply, Chloe smiled. She turned to Sophia. What are you hiding in the back? Who's the real homewrecker here? Don't you know that karma exists? Sophia's face paled. Chloe saw me standing behind them and sighed, as if arguing with them was beneath her. This world runs on karma, Sophia, Chloe said. Whether you believe it or not, the pain I went through will come back to you tenfold. With her back to me, I couldn't see her expression. Chloe waved her hand dismissively. George, take them and leave. I never want to see any of you again. David took her hand, and together they vanished into a sea of flowers. Watched their figures fade away, my heart heavy with bitterness. Sophia's face darkened as she turned to me, her voice full of malice. What's the matter? What? Still too caught up in your dreams to wake up? I looked at her and thought about all the times she had deliberately inserted herself into my marriage with Chloe. It was Sophia who had revealed too. David, the shameful truth that I had faked rescuing that cat just to win Chloe's favor. A wave of disgust rose inside me. Without saying a word, I turned and walked away because of that foolish gamble. I had lost the girl who had been with me throughout my entire youth. In the end, I lost to David. I had forever lost the love of my life.